Did you ever wonder why there is life on this planet? And why we are here? Why there is a life form with the intelligence to answer these questions, or at least try to answer them with the help of science? Today I have invited a guest. We sit in the top floor at the northwest tower of my house, looking out at the snowy weather. The history of mankind started more than 13 billion years ago with a Big Bang. The laws of physics that appeared at the time allowed for life to exist. But life did not pop up anywhere. It needed a very special place. Our Earth was such a place. It has the right distance from the sun to have liquid water. It has an iron-rich molten core and a rocky outside that allows the environment to change by plate tectonics and the Earth to retain an atmosphere. And thanks to the invention of photosynthesis, that atmosphere eventually became enriched with oxygen. Another requirement is to have larger atoms such as carbon, oxygen and nitrogen. The Earth has an ample supply of such atoms because it came late in the history of the universe. Larger atoms are formed in stars. When the stars explode, they are made available elsewhere. Carbon can be used to create complex molecules, the molecules that all life on Earth is based on. The Earth had the right qualities for life some 4 billion years ago, and life actually appeared soon after that. There are trillions of planets in the universe, so based on statistics, one would expect that many have the necessary qualities. Yet I think that Earth is special. What happened on Earth is a big surprise. Molecules based on carbon can appear spontaneously, but we do not understand how these molecules were put together to form the first life, in the form of cells capable of replicating. If I had been religious, I would see the Big Bang as God showing his face, and the appearance of life as God using his hand. Apparently God used his hand a second time to allow evolution to create intelligent life, and that took some 4 billion years. And 4 billion years is a very long period, even on a cosmic scale. So intelligent life forms are probably extremely rare, if they exist elsewhere at all. I'm pretty sure we will never know because space is so vast and there's no reason to expect life in our part of the universe. The important point is that in the absence of other suitable planets, there is no planet B to escape to if we destroy Earth. For most of the time since life appeared, there were only microscopic forms. The first animals with nervous systems came some 600 million years ago. Then it all exploded. 500 million years ago, there were all sorts of animals, including early vertebrates. Evolution shoved its muscles. Two things happened that helped evolution move in the direction of humans. One was that the animals needed to move around. In order to do so, they needed a nervous system. I have mentioned the other event, the introduction of photosynthesis, which created oxygen, allowing animals to colonize land. Nervous systems proved to be very important. The types of animals with the most advanced form of nervous systems are the most successful. In short, nervous systems were a great invention. All of these systems, regardless of the species of animal, are built on the same principles. It's the same type of cells and the same way the cells communicate. What happened over the last 500 million years was that the nervous systems became more complex, and I consider the human form to be the pinnacle of evolution. Some 320 million years ago, our ancestors started to colonize land. We call these animals for amniotes. They eventually formed reptiles, birds, and mammals. In these amniotes, evolution took a surprising twist with far-reaching consequences. It invented feelings. Feelings were meant to help animals make decisions, particularly in complex situations. But feelings need to be felt. The need to feel probably started the evolution of consciousness, because all the other processes the brain caters to can probably be programmed as you program a computer. Only feelings need consciousness. Even advanced behavior can be performed in the absence of consciousness. There is another twist to the invention of feelings. Success in biology is measured as the biomass of organisms or the number of offspring. With animals that can feel, it can also be measured in terms of happiness. Long before dinosaurs, there were probably animals with a form of consciousness, but that's a long shot from having human consciousness and human intelligence. So I still have not explained why humans appeared, and that was a miracle. The key point is that evolution favors the more fit, and higher intelligence means higher fitness. We know the recent events in our evolutionary history quite well. Apes like gorillas, chimpanzees and orangutans appeared some 25 million years ago, and about 7 million years ago our ancestors split with the chimpanzees. This is a short time in evolutionary terms, so our genes are still some 98% similar to those of chimpanzees. Since that split, the Earth has seen many human-like species. If you go back only 100,000 years, there were 7 or 8 species or subspecies of humans, all highly intelligent. Yet only one of them survived, Homo sapiens, us. Perhaps our ancestors were slightly smarter than the other species, or perhaps they were just more aggressive. We know they interbred with 2 other forms of humans, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, and we know the human success started about that time, that is some 50,000 years ago. But why? Why the success? I think the key point was that we got advanced language, and that language gave rise to cumulative culture. This has given us all sorts of inventions and a science that can explain things. The human brain resembles a smartphone or a Swiss Army knife in that it contains a lot of functions or modules. Some functions evolved just recently, such as our capacity to speak. Others have been with our ancestors for several 100 million years, like our tendency to seek food and to be aggressive. Evolution made our brains highly flexible. They are easily molded by experiences. Thus, although we are all born with the same modules, they appear different in different people. For example, some people never get angry, others explode at anything. Our innate behavioral tendencies can be strengthened, or they can be subdued to nothing. The individual differences depends roughly 50-50 on your genes and the environment that shaped you. Genetically speaking, we are all very similar because our last common ancestors lived less than 200,000 years ago, and that's the blink of an eye for evolution. Yet we appear different, particularly as to skin color and hair pigmentation, but that is because color variation depends on a few mutations in a couple of genes, so they can change easily. Even inbred strains of animals, such as goats and cows, have similar differences in pigmentation. It is the extreme plasticity of the human brain that explains why people appear so different in the way they behave or think. This means that what sort of environment or culture we create decides what sort of society we get. The laws of physics, or God if you prefer, gave us something very special. It is up to us to make the most of it. Don't you agree, Mr. Darwin?